Well, good morning and welcome to Coffee with Ken. I'm Ken Biberaj, a managing director at Savills, a leading tenant advisory commercial real estate firm. We are in week 21 of social distancing as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. In the news today, a deadly blast in Beirut has killed more than 100 people and injured over 4,000. And congressional negotiators will reconvene today on Capitol Hill to work through a new corona relief package. Today's topic is 2020. What's at stake for our courts and our Constitution and democracy? We're joined by former U.S. Senator and current president of the American Constitution Society, Senator Russ Feingold. Good to see you, Senator.
And I'm delighted to be on this show, and congratulations on having it. And I'm actually doing this from Wisconsin on Lake Superior. First day for semi-vacation, but during this whole pandemic, you can keep working through this mechanism. So thank you very much for having me on.
Oh, it's so excited. I'm honored that you would come on, and obviously no shortage of topics to discuss today. Let's start right out the gate. I mean, what have the last 21 weeks been like for you? I mean, you just took over in March. You must be the most popular boss because I think, what was it, 2 days after you came in, you told everyone they had 5 months off? Or how did it go?
Pretty much the same for everybody, all organizations. But yeah, I was teaching full-time at Stanford Law School as a visiting professor, and I thought I was just going out to Washington to spend a couple of days to, get to know everybody, and I was going to start full-time in June. So I went into the office, I think on March 9th, met everybody, and then the next morning I had to come in and say, go home. So I literally was with the staff for 1 day, but they have pulled together, and we have had a marvelous 4.5 months of programming virtually that isn't as good as in person, but I'll tell you something, a lot of creativity, and because there are chapters all over the country of both student chapters and lawyer chapters of the American Constitution Society, they have found that virtually they can actually combine their groups and get some pretty exciting speakers virtually. It was harder to do before because people would have to travel. So there are some elements of this that have worked very well for the organization, but of course someday we would like to get back together in person.
Well, let's dive into the organization first before some of our other topics, right? So ACS really is unique in that sense, right? You have a national network, really grassroots focused. I think a lot of folks try to compare you a little bit to the Federalist Society. Maybe give us a quick overview about, what ACS is vis-a-vis Federalist and where you think the organization should be going under your leadership now.
I mean, as an historical matter, it's not unfair to make the comparison. The Federalist Society really started in about 1980 after the Robert Bork hearings, where he was not confirmed, and many on the right felt that somehow they had to respond. So they created this organization, but it wasn't until 20 years later that progressives and others who believe in a fair rule of law realized after the Bush v. Gore decision that there needed to be some kind of an organization of progressive and moderate lawyers and people concerned about those issues. So the American Constitution Society was created about 20 years ago. But it's not, in my view, supposed to be a mirror image or the opposite of the Federalist. The Federalist Society is a very private organization that has huge, unlimited donations from some of the powerful interests in the country, like the Koch brothers and others. And they make sure that people that they promote for the judiciary follow a very strict litmus test of certain issues, and have basically taken over the role of choosing judges from the president and the Senate, which to me is offensive and wrong. Our approach is the opposite. We are pivoting toward making sure that if there is a new administration, there will be a wide pool of people that we can recommend based on 40 working groups across the country who are working in their own communities to identify people from their own areas who are diverse demographically, who are diverse in terms of practice, such as public defenders and community activists, who will respect the role of the president and the role of the Senate, but it will be one that actually looks like America, rather than the kind of thing that the Federalist Society has successfully done. So I'm proud of the different approach and the fact that we're the only progressive organization that can actually pull that off.
Yeah. So lay out the stakes for us, right? I mean, I think a lot of folks remember Merrick Garland's nomination to the court. Walk us through how things in the last decade have evolved as it comes as it relates to appointees to the federal bench, right? Not just the Supreme Court, which gets a lot of attention, right? We have three equal branches of government, presidency and the Congress get a lot of attention. But when you talk about the judicial branch and how judges are appointed and the approval, take us through what the last decade has been like, and what do you think the stakes are in 2020?
Well, Ken, it's been a really rough and very dismal decade in this regard, and the stakes are unlimited, but in many ways they're hidden. People don't realize what role the courts play. At the Supreme Court level, my goodness, they have gutted the Voting Rights Act after decades of a bipartisan approach. They have made it impossible to do something about gerrymandering and political reapportionment, which has greatly affected unfairly the politics of where I am right now in Wisconsin. They have gutted our campaign finance laws, which of course I care about, having the Campaign Feingold bill, one of the two authors. That Citizens United decision was a lawless decision, and they have expanded a number of other areas that are of deep concern, almost always siding with the corporate side in major consumer lawsuits. So that's at the Supreme Court level, which is obviously very consequential. Yeah. But it's also consequential what happens at the courts of appeal and the federal district courts. Now you've got Trump having confirmed 200 people for openings, many of which should have been for President Obama. Of course, the most famous one is the Supreme Court one, Merrick Garland, which was nothing less than stealing the Supreme Court. It was, in my view, unconstitutional and illicit, and something needs to be done about it. But they didn't leave it there. What they've done, led by the Federalist Society, is vet people to be hard right conservatives, sometimes 37, 38 years old, people that might be on the bench for 50 or 60 years. And it's sort of a long-term stealing of the courts from a open-minded, fair-minded court system that may go through several generations. In other words, if you're a 20-year-old, you might be stuck with the same people when you're 30 years old, when your own career is over, and it means that your dreams and the dreams for your generation are going to be stifled by the dead hand of people who used a very questionably elected president to fill up all these seats. So our goal is to be ready in case there is a new president to try to reverse this really terrible assault on our system of justice.
So based on that and the kind of zero-sum game that kind of exists today, you were a progressive senator, but you voted for Chief Justice Roberts, right? I mean, how dramatic have things changed between that vote you did then, where I think you took an approach where maybe he was the best you would get from the Bush administration, versus today, what role maybe senators should be playing? I mean, should they be taking a fair and balanced approach too, or should it be just a hard-nosed rejection right out the gate because of how serious the stakes have become and how confrontational it is today based on Merrick Garland and some of these other appointees?
Well, things really have gone off the rails, even compared to George Bush II's administration. That was frustrating enough. But then there was still some notion that you generally would vote for judges unless there was a president's choice, unless there was some compelling reason not to. And for some people, that might mean ideology. For others, it might not. You're right that when Chief Justice Roberts was a possibility, I had a chance to meet with him, and I realized, and I think time has proven me right, that was the best we were going to get. We were going to get a much less flexible, much less institution-oriented person. So I'm no big fan. I think he's done terrible things on voting rights, on workers' rights, on voting, on campaign finance. But as we've seen in this term, at least he does not follow an absolute script from the Federalist Society or the hard right. So that was the rationale. The problem now is I think people feel that that's not the dynamic anymore, that people are on two different sides. And I will say this, as I said earlier, the Mitch McConnell and the right stole the Supreme Court. There has to be some kind of compensation for that. There has to be some kind of reparation. You can't just go back in if the Democrats take the majority and say, oh, that's too bad that happened. Now we're just going to play nice. There has to be some kind of an agreement to do something about the fact that that seat was stolen and bring back some fairness, because there was no justification whatsoever for not allowing President Obama, the duly elected president, to fill that Supreme Court seat. So that's something that needs to happen, and I think a reasonably aggressive approach to that, not a slash and burn approach. The goal should be to get back on track so that we're not in a completely partisan position when it comes to judges. But it can't be done unless there's some fair compensation for what's been done.
Interesting. So let's talk a little bit about the party platform, right? The Vice President Biden and Democratic Party last week announced that they were going to be open to some structural court reform. What does that mean in your eyes? Where do you think we should be going as you think about and reacting to where we are today and in creating a more fair and equitable judicial system? What do you think needs to be done structurally?
I think I'm very pleased to see that report, because this needs to be not just a Democrat conversation, or Republican conversation, but a national conversation.
Yeah.
And actually, it's interesting because you asked about the Federalist Society. It was those folks that originally said, wait a minute, we're not sure that judges should have unlimited term. They were the original ones that said, well, maybe there should be an 18-year limit and so on. I used to think the idea of having limited judicial tenure or having more justices on the court, I used to think they were terrible ideas. I've changed my mind. I am president of the ACS, so I'm not recommending anything particular, but I think these things should be taken seriously. I think we should ask ourselves, is it appropriate that a 35-year-old person is put on the Supreme Court for 50 or 60 years? I think that's dubious. Is it appropriate that people have to stay in the court even who are very ill or potentially very ill just to make sure that somebody else doesn't get to fill that seat with a right winger? I think that's a sad thing. Yeah. People of that age should not be put through that kind of thing. Somebody wants to stay on the court, great. But clearly the pressure on Justice Ginsburg is exceptional, and it's an unseemly thing. So the ACS has in the past and wants to continue to facilitate the conversation about what reforms should be made, and it appears that the Democratic platform will suggest openness, I think, for the first time of at least the Democratic Party in this. And as I said, in the past, some conservatives have been interested in this because clearly the founders did not intend that somebody be on the bench for 70 years. This is just, it doesn't make sense for a society that is changing so quickly.
So one of the things that we've noticed in these coffee conversations has been that COVID really is an accelerant, right? Whether you're in the movie industry and now we've accelerated to streaming services, or if you advocate for issues of income inequality or access to opportunity or criminal justice reform or what's happening in the streets today, you're seeing in live time, things are just speeding up. So when we think about our democracy in general, what type of structural changes do you think maybe have accelerated, right? Whether it's reform of the Electoral College, whether it's a realization last week when President Obama, John Lewis's funeral, talked about eliminating the filibuster. Are there some kind of systemic things that exist in our democracy where maybe now they're ripe for review or for change? And, it's a living, breathing document that, where are we today that we may need to adjust some things?
Well, you're absolutely right. Billy, the COVID-19 has laid bare a lot of structural problems with our system that, a lot of people were aware of, but until you see the incredible negative impact on many people of this problem, you don't realize how urgent it is. So ACS was able, I was very proud of the staff. I had just come there. We were able to put on 10 different virtual programs that had to do with different implications of COVID-19 and policing, including obviously with the racial injustice issues as well. And also we put on programming relating to the George Floyd situation, looking at issues like qualified immunity in the area of policing and the wisdom of that or the lack thereof. We talked about COVID-19 and the disparate impact and access to health care. We talked about COVID-19 and the problems for workers. Some of the things that have been reported about what happened to workers at Amazon, people being forced to go to work. COVID-19 and the impact on voting. Look what happened right here in Wisconsin when our primary, where people were given a Hobson's choice of being unable to get the absentee ballot in or going in person during the middle of the pandemic. And frankly, Ken, the overall idea of the role of government is being highlighted in a way that actually causes people to say, wait a minute. maybe having an effective national government is not a bad thing. A number of the scholars that we work with at ACS have said this is a chance to reevaluate this. It's almost simplistic anti-government stuff that really Reagan so effectively articulated. You want a functioning government at both the national and state level at this point. And as you say, these inequalities are enhanced by racial injustice. Electoral college is actually a fruit of the history of slavery and racial issues in this country. The issues of how the Senate is composed, some people believe, is connected to that. So you are hearing more fundamental calls for getting rid of the Electoral College, but at the same time, simply trying to make sure that the institution of voting itself, which is being attacked, and especially in our state, with voter IDs, and limiting early voting, and partisan gerrymandering, all of these things are now on the table, and you know, it's a very tragic time, incredibly tragic time. But if there is a change in the fall and a willingness on the part of the Congress and the president and the courts, as well as the various state governments, to relook at these things, it could be a time of dynamic institutional change that's been long overdue. And if it happens, it will have come because of the combination of COVID-19, of the racial tragedies that have occurred, George Floyd, and frankly, of irresponsible government at the national level. All these things may lead to a significant period of change.
It's funny because we like to talk about what type of silver lining might you find out of all of this chaos and crisis we're dealing with. So I think you're onto it there, right? I mean,
how many people want to go through this one again?
Yeah,
they're gonna say, wait a minute, we want a functioning, compassionate government that respects everybody's life and everybody's family, regardless of their economic status. And that is something that is obviously not in place at this point.
Yeah, one of the things I like about ACS and what you're pushing, it includes efforts related to diversity on the bench, really expanding who is participating on the judiciary. Walk us through that, right? Like, you come from a political background, you understand grassroots organizing, you understand kind of campaigns. How do you use ACS and your national network to really encourage, support, and build a farm system of potential future advocates for the judiciary?
Yeah, well, ACS has taken the lead in issuing reports on the lack of diversity in the courts. There's stunning numbers, even in the past, but now these 200 people I mentioned that Trump has put on the bench, just overwhelmingly male, overwhelmingly white, in a way that is disproportionate to the population of this country. And so this needs to change. This should not be a system of courts for the next 6 years of 37-year-old white right-wingers. That is not a fair justice system. It's fine to have some of them, but not overwhelming. And so we are trying to make sure that the pool of people that a new administration, if there is one, looks at is ethnically and demographically diverse. We are working with local organizations that represent diverse peoples in every community that we can in the country. Now 40 working groups across the country. Also, we have to reflect the fact that not every person that a Democrat might appoint will necessarily be somebody who understands the concerns of a lot of working people and consumers. A lot of Democrats can be very corporate oriented. So we would like to see that the bench be diverse from the point of view of practice. We'd like to see some public defenders who see things from the point of view of people that have been charged with crimes. We'd like to see community activists who, of course, are lawyers, but have, instead of sitting on the bench or being at a corporate law firm, have been out working with people in the communities. And so the list that we are coming up with is carefully worked out with those organizations and groups at the local level. This is not just a group of lawyers saying on their own, oh, we want this guy and this. We want this to reflect this country. And that's why this list is going to be, proposed people is going to be one of the better ones in the country. That will mean that if we do get openings, and if there is an opportunity for a new president to fill these openings, that will be filled by people who provide some balance to undo what's been done under this current administration with putting such an overwhelmingly white, male, conservative, very young group of people on the bench.
You've been speaking a lot recently about the rule of law. You've touched upon qualified immunity. What did you think when you saw the Attorney General in Lafayette Park on that day when they pushed back protesters? What are you seeing when you see images like that in the streets?
Shock and disgust. I can't believe it. I've been around long enough to remember when we had attorneys general, even under Republicans, who stood up for the rule of law. When Gerald Ford had to come in as president after Watergate, he picked Edward Levy as his attorney general, considered one of the great college presidents in the country at the University of Chicago, but he was a Republican. He was a guy that promoted Robert Bork for the Supreme Court. He is known for having repaired the Justice Department and been nonpartisan person. Same thing under Bush. John Ashcroft was a very conservative man, but I served with him in the Senate, and I voted for him too. I got in some trouble with progressives for that. But it was John Ashcroft who, from his hospital bed, said no to the White House in terms of extending the illegal wiretapping program. So, to have those examples in my mind, and then to see Barr, who, from all we could tell, was a fairly normal attorney general under the first George Bush, come in and become nothing but a partisan hack. And then for him to personally participate in trying to destroy peaceful protest across from the White House, I was shocked. And, he's doing other things that are appalling to me. I've led the charge in terms of our organization and in the country on questioning this resumption of the federal death penalty. Mm-hmm. Barr is literally hell-bent on executing as many people as he can before the election, and he's doing it. We hadn't had a moratorium on the federal death penalty was put in place under Bush. Mm-hmm. And it had been 17 years till last month that there had not been an execution. They executed 3 people. They've scheduled 2 more for the end of this month and 2 more for September. In other words, it's almost like a bloodlust because there is no consensus in this country that we should be doing that. In fact, the polls are showing the strongest level of opposition to the death penalty in our history. It is racially biased. And we now have, back in the day, I used to sort of be proud that Michigan and Wisconsin were the only states that had not had any executions since before the Civil War. We just not had the death penalty. There are now 22 states that have eliminated the death penalty. There are several others where their courts have ruled it unconstitutional. So I think it's fair to say a majority of the states, the majority of the American people don't want the death penalty, but Attorney General Barr is rushing to kill people as fast as he can against the growing consensus in this country. And we are doing everything we can to highlight this really cold-blooded thing that's going on in a country that really doesn't want that anymore.
Mm-hmm. Let's dive in a little bit on the qualified immunity aspect. I don't know if that's common knowledge to folks, but when you look at federal troops in the streets with no markings, no insignia, we had Secretary Jay Johnson on a couple of weeks ago, and he very clearly pointed out that you should have some kind of identification of what agency you're from. I think there's over 80 agencies within the government that have law enforcement capacity, right? So it's a little unwieldy how many groups can be tapped and put out there. What are you looking to accomplish here? What do you think would be a step in the right direction as it relates to kind of qualified immunity or identification or what's happening in the streets, and if seeing what's happening in Portland and beyond?
Those are, of course, interrelated but separate issues at the same time. And on qualified immunity, I think there's a real questioning now of giving that scope of immunity to police officers and whether it's really justified in light of the horrible stories that have come out. So there is talk of both legislative and lawsuit actions that may well limit qualified immunity. And I hear more and more about it. We did some programming on this in the context of policing and racial justice issues right after the George Floyd disaster and tragedy. And so I think you're going to find that, and something we certainly will highlight as an issue to make sure people understand what the proposals really are nationally and at the state level as well. Now, the issues that have to do with the use of people in the Department of Homeland Security in places like Portland is a whole nother series of issues. It's an outgrowth of some of the mistakes that were made after 9/11. I was the only senator to vote against the Patriot Act because I thought it had terrible loopholes. It had nothing to do with terrorism. I voted against the war in Iraq because it was based on a phony desire to accomplish political goals. And I also voted, it was one of 9 senators to vote against the Department of Homeland Security. There were a variety of reasons, but one of them was I was concerned that it could be used internally as an alternative to the military without the traditions and that we've always had. We don't have an internal military. And so, that was a very historic moment when that awful incident occurred in Lafayette Park, where the military actually had second thoughts and they said, we're not doing this anymore. It's because that Department of Homeland Security was set up in a very loosey-goosey kind of way that the president was advised that he could do the same things without identifying people that apparently were trained to work on drug-related cases, busting up protests, arresting people, really against the law. Almost every expert that I have heard talk about this agrees that this is against the law. Paul Rosenzweig is a Federalist Society person of the past, conservative, who went on with me on Christiane Amanpour the other day and said, look, I was at Department of Homeland Security at the time Mr. Feingold voted against it, and we heard that concern, but we didn't think it was likely. He now says he apologizes because now, in fact, he sees that is being exploited, not by President Bush, but by President Trump. And so, Ken, I'd say the overall lesson of this is, if you have a crisis and you agree to certain things, it may not come to bite you until the next crisis, 20 years later. But now all these things are coming back to bite us, particularly the very unclear way in which the authorities of the Department of Homeland Security are constituted.
Yeah. Well, look, just to close it up, I want to be sensitive to your schedule. One of the things you're most famous for, obviously, is campaign finance reform and the McCain-Feingold bill. One of the things that was also interesting when you left the Senate is you didn't go right into lobbying. I'd love to get kind of your take on where things stand today in terms of that revolving door in Washington. How bad is it really? And, where are we now 20 years later on campaign finance reform and influence of money in politics and so on?
Those are both huge issues. And of course, I can't specifically endorse legislation, but I can mention the fact that in the House, in particular, H.R. 1, the first bill of the whole Congress this year or these 2 years was about issues relating to campaign finance reform, where much more has to be done. And I certainly, of course, have publicly criticized the Citizens United decision, which was a terrible piece of judicial lawmaking that struck down important protections that prevented the overwhelming influence of corporations on the political process. Now, in terms of lobbying, I remember Esquire magazine did a survey of who was the best looking member of Congress. I didn't get that. Who was the best dressed member of Congress? I didn't get that. What I was the number one enemy of the lobbyists. So I was proud of that. And not that I hate lobbyists or don't think they have a role, but it's out of control. The system is out of control. And that's why I didn't want to go do that sort of thing. And I was more interested in teaching and doing this kind of work. But this is an area where the connection between money and politics gets very raw, including people being hired to represent foreign governments, which when I was a senator, I certainly felt should not be allowed. And I believe Chuck Schumer and others have proposed at least a 10-year ban on former members of Congress representing foreign governments. This is a very dangerous thing for our national security. So, there's no, lack of things that need to be done. And we at the American Constitution Society want to highlight these issues so that the public really knows where they're at right now, particularly the people that are interested in the legal system, so that people can take it to study it, to write about it, to litigate about it, to legislate about it. Our job is to help kind of make people have an opportunity to do this. And we get wonderful audiences, sometimes hundreds of people. We had a Supreme Court, a review of the recent Supreme Court term a few days ago, where there were 300 or 400 people on listening to the top experts in the country. So we're going to continue to do that programming and work with our 200 student chapters and 50 lawyer chapters to help move this country in a progressive and fair-minded direction.
Well, look, we're so excited that you've taken over at ACS. We're so grateful you took the time this morning to be with us and then tell us a little bit about some of the exciting things you're working on. So no shortage of stuff on your plate, Senator. So congratulations on that.
Thank you, and goodbye from the Great Lake Gitche Gumee, which is the Native American name for Lake superior.
Amazing. Well, Senator, thank you to everyone tuning in. Appreciate you listening to our Coffee with Ken today. Next week, we're going to be having a conversation about cybersecurity, workforce innovation, growth, and resilience. In the meantime, please remember, practice social distancing, wash your hands, and wear a mask. Thanks so much, Senator. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.